Hello and welcome to Carmichael Clan Radio, the official podcast of Clan Carmichael USA. Welcome back to episode 13 of Carmichael Clan Radio. I'm your host, Scott Carmichael. With National Tartan Day right around the corner, I was thrilled to be joined this week by Professor Dauvit Broun of the University of Glasgow and Professor Ewen Cameron of the University of Edinburgh for a history roundtable about the Declaration of Arbroath. In this second episode of my two-part series dedicated to exploring the history and significance of the Declaration of Arbroath, Professors Broun and Cameron examine the history behind the letter from the Scottish barons to Pope John XXII, now known as the Declaration of Arbroath, why the letter was written and what the barons and King Robert I hoped it would achieve, its effects on modern-day politics and political thought, and where, if anywhere, it belongs among the most influential historical political documents throughout history. Dr. Broun and Dr. Cameron are both highly respected historians and are among the leading scholars of Scottish history, so I was really honored when they both agreed to be on the show for a double interview. This episode was lots of fun to record and was really interesting, and I'm happy to bring this show to you. As always, a few things before we begin. The weather is warming up here, and June is right around the corner, so if you're planning on attending the Carmichael Gathering in Scotland this summer, you're quickly running out of time. To learn more or to reserve your spot, follow the link in the show notes below or visit the Clan Carmichael International website at www.carmichael.co.uk. Go ahead and mark your calendars, too, to attend the Grandfather Mountain Highland Games in Linville, North Carolina this July. It's been a few years since Clan Carmichael has had a presence at these games, but we're registered and will be there, so make plans to attend if you can. If you're interested in learning about becoming a member of Clan Carmichael USA, visit the Clan Carmichael USA website at the link in the show notes or visit www.clancarmichaelusa.com. If you're still not a member, we hope you'll consider joining and becoming part of one of the best clans today. And now, this roundtable discussion on the Declaration of Arbroath. All right, so Dr. Dauvit Broun and Dr. Ewen Cameron, thank you so much for joining me today on Carmichael Clan Radio. Getting one guest is always a delight for me, but having two at one time, this is the first time I've done it, and it's a real treat for the listeners to be joined by both of you to share your knowledge and some information about the Declaration of Arbroath. So welcome to the show. Dr. Broun, I wanted to start with you and talk a little bit about the history behind the Declaration of Arbroath. What was going on in Scotland and in England in the years leading up to 1320 when the Declaration of Arbroath was created? Kind of set the political scene for us and help us understand why the Declaration was even needed in the first place.
Yeah, well, thank you very much, Scott. So one crucial part of this is that Robert Bruce had, against the odds, successfully managed to retake Scotland from occupation, initially by Edward I and then Edward II, culminating in the capture of Berwick in 1318. And that, you might have thought, was obviously mainly about beating the English, but actually its immediate significance was winning the Civil War, because when Robert Bruce took the throne in 1306, it was in, shall we say, very controversial circumstances. He'd killed his main rival, John Comyn, and had taken the throne despite the fact that John Balliol, the properly inaugurated king back in 1296, was still alive and had an adult son. So really the political situation isn't just about taking control over Scotland against the English, but above all, at this stage, winning the Civil War against the Comyn family, who are the most most important, most powerful in Scotland before Bruce savaged them so severely, and all their supporters and those who supported a Balliol kingship. Mm-hmm. And this is important because part of the background here is that Edward Balliol, the son and heir, John Balliol had died in 1314, so Edward Balliol is now back in England, having been in France with his dad, and he's back in England and seeking support. So within Scotland, there are those people who, of course, were on the losing side or were squeamish about Robert Bruce as king in the first place, who were open to the idea, some of them eager for the idea of Edward Balliol becoming king instead. So you have these two dynamics, if you like, the conflict with the King of England and the internal conflict, and these are both significant. As far as the declaration goes, its immediate political context is that Robert Bruce, as I said, had retaken Scotland, and however, he was coming under intense pressure, him and his government, coming under intense pressure from the papacy, who were aligned for all sorts of complicated reasons of international politics, aligned with Edward II. So huge international pressure, threats of excommunication and so on, were being heaped on Robert Bruce and his government. And so the declaration was a response to this. It was sent as a letter in the name of the barons of Scotland, justifying Scottish independence and Bruce as the king. And it does seem to have had some impact. I mean, the sort of temperature went down a bit. The full forward thrust towards becoming international pariahs was resisted, and from then on, it's not a completely straight line, of course, but from then on we get to a stage of truce, and ultimately Edward III recognising Scotland as an independent kingdom with Robert Bruce as its king in 1328.
Okay. Is there any indication, or does it even matter, about who was winning? I guess winning would be the right word. The competition to be king. Was Robert the Bruce a popular leader before the declaration, or was the declaration an attempt to kind of shift in and take power from Balliol? And I guess we really can't know, but is there any indication that he might have been the chosen one before, or who was winning that race of popular opinion at the time?
Yeah, so there are different dynamics again going on here. I mean, the first, the most important one, of course, is simple military effectiveness. I mean, defeating your enemies in battle, taking control of all the strongholds, and in Bruce's case, destroying them, is the immediate reality.
Okay.
You ask about popularity, and that, of course, is very complicated in this period. A sign that things aren't entirely going Bruce's way is that in Parliament that he held in Scone in December 1318, one of the enactments was basically against people saying things against his government, and that was treated, at least according to the legislation, it could have made people, brought them to being imprisoned and so on. So there's an attempt to squash any resistance, even people chatting amongst themselves, saying how they mightn't be that keen on Robert Bruce. So there is that part of it. But the other part of it is that Bruce's whole military strategy depended on having popular support, because when he took strongholds, he destroyed them. So he banked on the fact that Edward II's government of occupation was so unpopular, and it was unpopular because it depended on, Edward II was unable to resource the strongholds which were being garrisoned by English troops or those in Edward II's legions. He couldn't support them, so they were having to raid in the countryside to try and support themselves. So you've got this inevitable dynamic of basically people were absolutely fed up of these garrisons in Edward II's name. So it was a very a very nifty tactic, you could say, that Robert Bruce sort of recognised this. So he was actually going to destroy the strongholds. But he took this to a very impressive length, because it wasn't just your average castle that was laid to ruin, but places of iconic significance, like Roxburgh Castle, Stirling Castle, Edinburgh Castle. These are places which had huge significance as centres of the Scottish kingship. It's a bit like laying waste to Windsor Castle or Buckingham Palace. So he meant this. I mean, this was going to be a kingship that depended on having an element of popular support. So if we come back to what we mean by popular, there are these different dimensions. So you've got the sort of political dimension, if you like. So you've got the people who were politically engaged, they were the nobility and their retainers, and their allegiances will follow family lines, basically. And they, you can see, are the people, you can imagine them being the people that are being targeted by the legislation in December 1318. And then you've got the broad spectrum of people who are able to carry arms, that are expected to be the infantry, and indeed people who are not expected to be the infantry. They're just, the servants and so on in the countryside and the towns. So they as I say, I think they have you can imagine them having a more immediate problem with their experience of Edward II's administration, and they just want that to be got rid of. And Robert Bruce is the person that's doing it for them.
Sure. So I guess it's safe to say that Robert the Bruce's actions in this case gathered more support than this document did, that he was actually taking care of an English problem for the Scots.
Yes, exactly. I mean, one thing just to say, it's quite an interesting thing to think about, is it's very easy for us today, talking about this, to see it as Scots versus English.
Right.
But we have to understand that then that meant something a little bit different from what it means today. Then it was very much about your allegiance. So we're thinking about the nobility in particular. It's about your allegiance. So you can have people who are described as English, regarded as English, who we would think of as Scots, and they can move, sometimes overnight, from supporting Edward II to being English to supporting Robert Bruce and becoming Scottish. Now it's not possible to pick this up directly in the periods, but it's very clear and quite strong, actually, in the most famous piece of historical literature relating to Robert Bruce, which is John Barbour's epic poem on Robert Bruce, written in the 1370s. He has a very clear idea of that's what it means to be Scottish or English. So it can be helpful then to see this in terms of Robert I versus Edward II, rather than Scots versus English in some elemental sense.
I think that's definitely worth pointing out. I guess in the modern context, we think of it as where a border runs between England and Scotland, and depending on what side of that border you fall, that determines your allegiance. But that definitely wasn't the case back then. I've been reading about the Declaration and talking to people about it, and that's honestly the first time I've really considered that point. So it is worth pointing out for sure.
Well, just to say, can I just say a couple of things about
Sure.
that? I mean, one is that in the Declaration itself, it's about allegiance to a line of kings, 113 kings. That's what being Scottish is about. It's not about your family origins, because if you look at the lineup of barons, 30 plus barons, many of them have got family ancestry that are all over the place, not necessarily Scotland at all. But the other thing is, Amanda Beam did a really interesting piece of work looking at those people from Northumberland and Cumberland and Westmoreland who were dispossessed by Edward I's government for supporting the Scots. That is to say, back in 1296 when there was the invasion, they wouldn't come and fight in Edward I's army. Some of them actually went to Scotland to help fight against Edward I, and it was really a very significant percentage of these are small landowners, And they grew up in a world where the border was there. I mean, there were separate jurisdictions, but in terms of their everyday lives, trading, family interactions, and so on and so forth, it really wouldn't have meant terribly much until Edward I's invasion in 1296. You just get the sense of them being caught in a situation they just detested, of having to make a choice which they never imagined they would have to make or would make any sense to them anyway. So I think it's quite a powerful piece of work that Amanda Beam did on that.
Yeah, I'll try to. Is that Amanda Beam? Beam?
Beam, yeah, Beam. Yeah, so she's one of the most significant scholars of the period, and she has done the standard work on the Balliol family and John and Edward Balliol.
Okay. Let's talk a little bit about the document itself. I know one of the things that the Declaration was trying to accomplish was to, I guess, win the recognition of the Pope as Bruce being the King of Scots. So what did the document say? What was the overall objective of the Declaration of Arbroath? Maybe it was more than one thing. Maybe it was to, like I said earlier, to kind of for Bruce to put his stamp of authority on his kingship, and also maybe to, win the recognition of the Pope. What did the document say, and what was its overall objective?
Yes, well, as you've said, there's more than one way to read this, of course. But in crude terms, it starts with a very brief history of the origins of the Scots, that is, of the Scottish kingdom, and which, of course, there's a lot of legendary material there. It then explains how Edward I invaded Scotland and committed a whole range of atrocities, how Robert Bruce came to the rescue and led his people to freedom. It then has the most famous bits, which, of course, is explaining that they will fight for freedom, come what may, and nobody will give up freedom but with his life. And this is the most curious passage of all, you might say, is they say that if, for any reason, Robert Bruce were to submit to the King of England, to the English, then they would depose him and find somebody else who would maintain their freedom. And then the rest of the document ends up sort of addressing the Pope and basically daring him not to basically saying, there's a day of judgment for us all, and you've a particularly heavy responsibility given your position as the vicar of Christ on earth. And I put this very crudely, but anyway, it's quite interesting towards the end where it reads quite boldly. The other thing to say, of course, is that it is written in a very particular way. It's not just in Latin, but it's in a very polished kind of Latin, which was recognised at the time as the sort of top diplomatic language, top register, appropriate for addressing the Pope. I mean, I'm not entirely sure how big a deal to make of this, to be honest. I'm not sure. I'm just not an expert in the field of international diplomacy. I suspect it's just what you do if you want to write properly to the Pope. And there would be plenty of people that could, churchmen in Scotland and elsewhere who could do it. But it is worth saying that it is fully dressed up piece of diplomatic prose, and it is a really effective, fairly brief and to the point argument for recognising Scotland as an independent kingdom with Robert Bruce as its king.
What was the reason? Can you talk a little bit about why it was necessary at that time to have the Pope's recognition as a king?
Yes, very good question. And I mean, to make a slightly crude international parallel, it's like getting United Nations recognition.
Okay.
So, because we're talking about Latin Christendom, we're not talking about the world, of course. We're just talking about Latin Christendom, and within Latin Christendom, the Pope is the ultimate authority.
Okay.
So you just can't be an independent king without papal recognition.
Oh, okay.
There is one way in which this is symbolised very succinctly, and that is, obviously when you become king, you go through a ceremony,
Right.
and there is, the absolute sort of top rank of king is anointed and crowned. And before the 13th century, there were a few kingdoms which had this, France and England, but not most. Most kings didn't actually go in for this. They went in for an inauguration on a throne, which is what was the situation in Scotland. But in the 13th century, there are kingdoms that sort of think, well, wait a minute, we just want to make sure that we are completely recognised as top-rank kings, as much as any other king is a king, but you have to ask the Pope for coronation anointment. You can't just give it to yourself. And the King of Aragon achieves this in 1204. The King of Norway achieves this in 1247. And the King of Scots tries, and I'm afraid is told no. And that's because of pressure from the King of England at the time. So what the King of Scots in the 13th century has to settle for is de facto recognition. So in all practical measures, they are recognised as independent, and the Pope says as much, and then slaps the King of England down when wanting to raise papal taxes in Scotland, saying it's unheard of to do this in another kingdom. So that was in 1251. But coronation anointment is denied until Robert Bruce. So ironically, after once Edward III recognises his independence, the Pope then gives Robert Bruce and future kings of Scots the right of coronation anointment, but ironically that is given days after Robert Bruce has actually died.
Oh, okay.
Of course, travel being such as it is, nobody knew that at the time, but there it was. So it was his son, his young son David, who was the first king of Scots to be crowned and anointed. So the Pope is in a unique position in being able to recognise the full sovereignty of a kingdom.
That's a real power move by Robert the Bruce to not only seek recognition as king in that competition between Balliol and the struggle for kingship in Scotland alone, but to also take it a step further and say, I'm going to go ahead and see if I can win the recognition of the Pope while I'm at it. Is there any evidence that exists today about any other pressures that were on the Pope? Because it seems kind of a far stretch to think that there was this pressure from Edward to not recognize Bruce or any Scottish king before as a king of Scots, and especially for Bruce having been excommunicated. What was it? Was it just this document itself, or what was it that changed the Pope's mind to where he decided that he would recognize Bruce?
Yeah, it's. Ultimately, it's because of the treaty with Edward III. So
okay,
that cleared away any obstacle to achieving coronation anointments. But the international politics is complicated, and I'm not an expert in that. It's a huge part of this is the sometimes very difficult relationship between the King of France and the Pope. That gets to the extent of the King of France sort of trying a Pope in his absence for Pope Boniface VIII. So, because the King of England is so often at war with the King of France in this period, that's a major part of the context of why Edward I invaded Scotland in the first place, is because he's been at war with the King of France and the Scots have refused to come and support him.
Okay.
So you can see the dynamics there are that the Pope is keen to be friends with the King of England because he's got trouble with the King of France, and of course the Scots King of Scotland and governments are keen to be. They've got to find their friends where they can, and King of France is a powerful one.
Yeah. Okay.
Can I just say one other thing about you said that was an interesting thing you said about power play by Robert Bruce. There is another really interesting dimension to this that Alice Taylor has recently brought to light, which is the idea of royal majesty is something that we take a little bit for granted, but this very exalted view of the royal office is something that was quite topical at the time. And Robert Bruce is very significant in a Scottish context for being the first Scottish king to really try and promote this. And this was all part, for example, of the legislation of 1318, which I referred to. But also, I mean, there's an extremely complicated legal text known as Regia Majestatem, that is Latin for Royal Majesty. These are actually the first two words of this whole text. And Alice Taylor has done a magnificent piece of work in making sense of this hugely complicated text. And one key dynamic of it is to promote this sense of Robert Bruce as having the full sovereignty and majesty of a king. And one practical dimension to this is that if you're seeing the king in these terms, then doing anything against him then becomes treason. And so the first sort of treason trial in Scotland is in 1320. It's in August, a few months after the Declaration of Arbroath. So while the Declaration of Arbroath was happening, there was this group of nobles, some of whom put their seals to the Declaration of Arbroath, who were already conspiring against Robert Bruce. And this conspiracy was discovered. They were tried for treason. Not all of them were convicted, which is interesting. Because it's trial by Parliament. Robert Bruce just can't send them to the scaffold on his own. But that's the first treason trial. Then you don't get that again until 1424, when James I comes back from captivity in England and asserts his authority by adopting again a very similar, rather exalted view of kingship. And 1425, the people who had been running the country in his absence are taken to the scaffold, tried in the same way. And that coincides with this text, Regia Majestatem, getting a new lease of life as well.
Okay. Seems that James I was keen on sending people to the scaffolds.
He was, I'm afraid. It was pretty brutal.
Yeah. Well, let's talk a little bit about some of the modern implications of the Declaration. You know, Dr. Cameron, I want you to jump in here at some point. You know, I know that over time, this has become a much more well-known and popular document. I think for a period of time, for several hundred years, it was probably not even known, I suppose. But, you know, what are the modern implications of this document today that are being felt?
Well, it's interesting because in the modern context, we're looking at the Declaration of Arbroath through our lens of the world being organised into nation states, which, as Davy has explained, was not really the position when the Declaration, as we would call it today, was composed. So that's our primary framework for understanding it. And then, of course, there's, there have been gaps. Historians have been excavating the extent to which it was known and referred to in the early modern period, and colleagues like Roger Mason and Davy's colleague Corin Bowie have demonstrated that it was maybe better known in the early modern period than we once thought. But of course, it's slightly awkward in some senses in post-Reformation Scotland, because there's perhaps an unwillingness to the Reformed Church and political leaders in Scotland to be too cognizant of the authority of the Pope. That's a problem for post-Reformation Scotland, post-1560 Scotland. So those two things, I think, are fundamental to our understanding of the Declaration. So modern nationalists and even people who are not explicitly nationalist in their political understandings, nevertheless have an implicit framework of the modern nation state, or even a modern understanding of Scotland as a nation, although Scotland has not, or maybe not yet, achieved nation state status. But nevertheless, people conceive of Scotland as an aspirant nation, and that fundamentally characterizes our understanding of the Declaration. And that, as Davy's been explaining, in the early modern period, even the boundary or the border between Scotland and England is a liminal territory. I mean, I came down from London, down to London on the train the other day from Edinburgh. You know, and you sweep across the Tweed and through Berwick, and you're in England. Perhaps more complicated when the Declaration was written. The other point, I suppose, that's crucial to make is that today, almost literally today, Scottish politics is undergoing a debate about the future constitutional position of Scotland, and nationalists argue for something that they characterise as independence. Mm-hmm. And so the Declaration is again usable in that context. Important again, I suppose, to understand that for much of post-Union Scottish history, so ever since the Union of 1707, the Parliamentary Union, Scottish politics has not been about the question of independence in an explicit way. Sometimes it is there implicitly again. So again, the current political environment, I guess you would say, the last 30 years or so, that independence has been a key issue in Scottish politics, and certainly in the last 20 years since the devolved Scottish Parliament was set up and the Scottish National Party has become an effective political force, which it wasn't for much of its history since the 1930s. Again, the Declaration of Arbroath is something which can be used by modern-day political nationalists, and the fact that they are a significant electoral force in Scotland, they form the Scottish government in the devolved system. That again pushes the Declaration up the agenda, and it was certainly much referred to in the independence referendum of 2014. I think Alex Salmond, who was the then leader of the SNP and First Minister, he did several media calls in Arbroath and was very fond of using the phrase declaration, the declaration of this, that, and the next thing to again sort of both implicitly and explicitly make a connection to the so-called Declaration of Arbroath. Now, of course, if you've talked to Laura Harrison, which I think you have, she will tell you, of course, in more detail than I can, the way in which the nomenclature of the document has evolved over the last couple of hundred years, and that's interesting. It was once often referred to as the Declaration of Independence. The Declaration of Arbroath seems to be quite a modern coinage, according to Laura's research. So that's quite interesting. So it's really about the nation state. It's about modern political nationalism. It's about the current political environment in Scotland that has put the Declaration back on the agenda. And then, of course, there is the transatlantic angle, which is a kind of separate topic, which we might come on to in a moment.
Yeah, that is an interesting point about how it's in the modern setting that the document has been, used, maybe as a prop, as a part of the building of this character of the Scottish Nationalist Party. I'd like to go back to Dr. Harrison's research now and kind of look back at the dates and see when the Declaration of Arbroath, the name, became more popular, and see if that coincides with the rise of the Scottish Nationalist Party and the talk of independence.
Yeah.
Maybe there is a similarity between the way many Americans use the American Declaration of Independence to kind of promote their political views. So it's interesting that same thing is, maybe being seen in Scotland also with the Declaration of Arbroath, and even with the name Declaration of Arbroath. So it is an interesting point.
Yeah, I suppose the other issue which the modern interpretations of the Declaration highlight is there's been a search in 20th century Scotland, 21st century Scotland, to construct a Scottish constitutional tradition in order to give intellectual support to the idea of independence. Now, there is a strong Scottish constitutional tradition. Scotland had a parliament and other assemblies before 1707, the General Assembly of the Church of Scotland, the Convention of the Royal Boroughs. and the Parliament or the estates itself. So there is a long constitutional tradition, and there's, in the last 30 or so years, there's been a huge amount of work to recover both the documents and the history and the vitality of the pre-1707 Scottish Parliament, which was once written off as a kind of rather sad and weak institution. But modern scholarship has built it up. Mm-hmm. And the importance of that, again, that the Declaration becomes significant there because, again, modern nationalists highlight this idea, and Davies explained the background of it, this idea of popular sovereignty.
Right.
So if you see the beginning of the Scottish Parliament, and when the members of the Scottish Parliament come up to make their oath or declaration of membership, many of the nationalists and some in other parties as well refer to this idea of the popular sovereignty, of the sovereignty of the people, and the Declaration of Arbroath is useful in that context, or a modern reading of it, I should say, is useful in that context. Now, of course, it's central to the debate about independence, because another way you can look at the debate in modern Scottish and British politics is between different kinds of sovereignty. The key constitutional tradition in England, Britain, the United Kingdom, is the idea of the sovereignty of Parliament, or the sovereignty of the monarch in Parliament, whereas Scottish nationalists and others supportive of devolution would argue that there's a different Scottish constitutional tradition which highlights the sovereignty of the people. Now, this is a phrase which is much used. Quite what it means is somewhat obscure to me, but it certainly is a feature of modern debate, and the Declaration is useful in that context. And other Renaissance Scottish political thinkers such as George Buchanan and others, their work is appealed to. But that has become a key soundbite in Scottish politics today, the idea that there's a different constitutional tradition that highlights the sovereignty of the people.
So one of the things when I was researching the article that I wrote was that the Declaration of Arbroath was the birthplace of modern popular sovereignty. Do you think that's an accurate statement, or does it all depend on, like you said, your definition of sovereignty and these different ways of looking at it?
Well, I mean, modern popular. Again, I suppose we're reading the Declaration of Arbroath. Again, I suppose another key context for it is we're reading it in a political environment where, in a democratic political environment, somebody, when I was reading around this just in the last week or so, somebody, I can't now remember who it was, perhaps Brian Cox, the Scottish actor who is a nationalist supporter, he argued that somehow the Declaration of Arbroath was the foundation of Scottish democracy. Mm-hmm. Davy might have one or two things to say about that, I would imagine. But we are reading the document in the context where, in a modern state where everybody has the right to vote, everyone has the right to participate in political decision-making and deliberation, and we elect a Scottish Parliament, we elect a UK Parliament, we elect all sorts of local governors as well. So popular sovereignty now is seen in that context, whereas I think perhaps what it meant back in 1320 is something entirely different, and you can't just draw a neat linear connection between those two things.
Sure. When you were talking, maybe it kind of occurred to me that maybe that connection is drawn in such a straight way is because the way the author of the Declaration of Arbroath described popular sovereignty is something that we recognize today as being similar as, to what we think of as popular sovereignty in 2023. That without the support of the people, that a king can't continue to rule, and that the king represents the people. And, maybe that's why we try to tie these two things together. Maybe that's why Brian Cox says that the Declaration of Arbroath is the foundation of Scottish democracy, because it does, I guess you could argue, resemble modern democracy today. Dr. Broun, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, no, I think that's very wise what you're saying there, and so as Ewan's been saying, it's how we're reading it today.
Mm-hmm.
So it isn't the foundation of modern democracy in some sort of historical sense, but it is as a sort of literary artifact. It has become this foundational document as a piece of prose that represents something from the past. I mean, the whole issue, it's enormously tangled, the way people in the Middle Ages thought about constitutions and the place of the king. Enormously tangled because, on the one hand, there was this sense that you needed a king in order to have, obviously, a kingdom and have law and order, and therefore you need and it's really the church who's taking a very clear line of this, that we can read what they say more than anybody else. You need a king to do these things, but is the king above the law or not as a result? And they just get into a sort of feedback loop on that all the time. And so at any given moment, to put it very simply, at any given moment, depending on the political circumstances and so on, you will get sort of different angles, so we say, on that feedback loop. I mean, Robert Bruce, as I've just been saying, with that amazing text, Regium Majestatem, is promoted as this top-level, totally autocratic type of king. But on the other hand, we've got the Declaration of Arbroath, which has this passage threatening to depose him. I should say that, and that's the main, it's that passage which is the main reason for talking about it as a constitutional document.
Sure.
Nobody thought of it as a constitutional document, of course, until modern times, not in the Middle Ages or early modern period. It was more about a statement of Scottish freedom, etc. And I should say I have argued, and I'm still inclined to stick to this, I have to say, that when that passage was written, what they were aware of was the internal audience, the barons whose seals were put on the document, to make it clear to them that if they thought they could just get rid of Robert Bruce and then the whole project would collapse, that wouldn't happen, that the governments, the Bruce party, will, come what may, find somebody to be the king, because they've defined being king as principally about defending Scottish freedom. I think that's how I've read it anyway. And it sort of feeds into the context about Edward Balliol being in England and drawing support. And he could have become king, but if he was king, and this is what actually happened in the 1330s, he would, because of the reality of the political situation, have to cave in to the King of England's demand, because he would need their support. Mm-hmm. And that's actually what happened in the 1330s. So anyway, that was. I should say that Professor Ted Cowan and Professor Hector McQueen are not convinced by this argument.
Okay.
So do bear that in mind. But that's my way of reading that famous sentence.
Well, since you're on the microphone, then you get to tell us your way. That's an interesting point too. The internal that I hadn't thought of before. Also, was the internal audience of the document, that as much as a document to the Pope or to the larger external audience was the internal audience, the barons themselves. That's a really fascinating statement.
Yeah, exactly. Because we should always remember it's drafted by Robert I's government and then presented to the barons, to whose names are listed, to put their seals to it. And actually you get quite a few other people who put their seals to it apart from those who are named. That is, put the seals to the file copy that we have that survives to this day.
Mm. So I read an article and it talked about, and this kind of comes back to that modern question and the current impact of the Declaration. I read an article that was it must have been from the nationalist point of view, because it also, I was reading it and I found it really informative, and then it closed with this connection between the Declaration of Independence and Declaration of Arbroath, and I thought, oh, okay, this again. But in that article, though, it was said that the Declaration of Arbroath belonged, next to these political essays and documents over time. It said it belonged next to Machiavelli's The Prince, Rousseau's Social Contract, John Locke's two treatises of government. I'm interested in getting both of your takes on this. Where does this document belong in the whole picture?
I mean, I don't think. I mean, I think it's in a separate category from works of political thought, such as those to which you've just referred, and Davy's given us the kind of understanding. It's primarily a diplomatic document. Some people have referred to it as a kind of manifesto, perhaps, but so, and it's drawing on it's drawing on the kind of context on in the period in which it was written. So I think it's in a different category from works such as those that you've referred to. Where I thought you were going to go, which is maybe, I mean, it's a foundational document in the sense that nations always try to construct their pasts, try to find a usable past. So you've got the U.S. Declaration of Independence. There's Magna Carta. One could think of documents, and is how they have been read and reread and reinterpreted in their contemporary contexts that makes them significant. And I think, apropos of the Declaration of Independence, the U.S. Declaration of Independence, then, I mean, I think it is difficult, to make that connection. Although recently, a Harvard historian, David Armitage, has kind of quite neatly turned this on its head, and suggested, the Declaration of the U.S. Declaration of Independence in the late 18th century is part of a process which brings documents like the Declaration of Arbroath back into political circulation again. The post-American Revolution, post-French Revolution, the creation of European nation states. In that context, the Declaration of Arbroath suddenly becomes usable again. So there maybe is a connection, as Armitage argues. It's maybe not so much that the Declaration of Arbroath influenced the U.S. Declaration of Independence, but the other way around. Which is quite a neat argument. And he also, very interestingly, discovered, I think it was Benjamin Franklin had in his library the work of, I think, a Swiss jurist, which contained, Davey probably knows more about this than I do, but contains a translation of parts of the Declaration of Arbroath. So it's not the connection is, and Armitage is not arguing this, is not as clear as those people who argue, that this was on Jefferson's desk when he was writing the Declaration of Independence. That's just not the case. But maybe it was part of the general mix again in this kind of implicit way. But I think Armitage's point again is a more elegant version of the point that I was trying to make myself, and it's in the post-U.S. Declaration of Independence period. Then you can reread the Declaration of Arbroath as an attempt to build a national constitutional tradition. I think it was quite an ingenious argument.
And that's interesting too. That it could be that Jefferson, like you said, he didn't have this sitting on his desk when he wrote the Declaration of Independence, but it could be that he was somewhat indirectly influenced by the climate that existed when he wrote the Declaration of Independence, or when he helped draft it, this climate that was partially constructed by documents like the Declaration of Arbroath. It's sort of the way one meal won't directly influence your health, but it all adds up to this environment in your body that determines your health. And so maybe he was influenced in an indirect way similar to that. And also, I was thinking when you're talking also that the Declaration of Independence is not a constitutional document. It's just a statement of freedom.
Yeah.
And maybe that's the correct way of thinking of the Declaration of Arbroath, is not a constitutional document. I teach U.S. government at the local high school here, and we study those documents by Rousseau and Locke.
Sure.
But we study those as parts of things that influenced the U.S. Constitution, which is a constitutional document. And so, maybe that's the most accurate way of looking at it, as just a statement of freedom.
Yeah. Yeah, I think so. Sorry, Davey, on you go.
No, I was just going to say, I think this is a really productive way to look at it, as something which comes to life in different ways, in different periods. And so I just wanted to, just give a sort of medieval perspective on that, because it is read in different ways as the centuries go by. It's not forgotten, because what happens, well, I should explain that what the image that we all have in our mind, that picture of the rather tatty document with the seals hanging off, and some of them have dropped off altogether, at the bottom is the file copy that was kept in the Royal Archives. I'll come back to that in a minute. But for medieval, file copies are not to be seen. They're tidied away into an archive, and so they're not for general view or reading. That's stuff gets stuffed into archives and generally forgotten. We could talk a bit about the archiving of documents back in those days, and it could quite easily be overwhelmed, shall we say. So there's that. So in the Middle Ages, a crucial stage was that somebody writing a history of the kingdom from origins to near the present day, and this is probably around 1330, so it's tricky to pin these things down, decided to end their history with the conquest of Edward I, the second conquest in 1304, and actually ended with the Declaration of Arbroath. So they sort of stuck that on at the end. A very interesting rhetorical gesture, but the thing that they were linking into was the sentence, which is all about Edward I's atrocities. So for them, that was the link that made the deck. Obviously, they were wanting to look forward to the fact that Scotland didn't remain conquered, and Robert Bruce's role in that. Although very interestingly, at least I think this is very interesting, if I've got all this right, is that they still stopped in 1304. So they couldn't quite bring themselves to, how do you talk about the period of Robert Bruce's reign? At that time, I can imagine that being really difficult, because it was a period of civil war, and that takes a while to settle down, Mm-hmm. So anyway, so you have, there are about 20 manuscripts survive of different versions of the standard history in Latin of the Scottish Kingdom, which has the Declaration of Arbroath embedded in it. And that is because of this link with the... its title is, Letter of the Barons complaining about the terrible things that Edward I has done.
Right.
So that's what they are highlighting at that time. Just to come back to the file copy,
Mm-hmm.
something which isn't really commented on too much, which I think is really interesting, is how it survived in the first place. Now, everybody knows it was taken to Tyningham House by the Earl of Haddington, and it kept there for generations. But the Earl of Haddington, who did this before he became Earl of Haddington, he was the Lord Clerk Register. His name was Thomas Hamilton. And in 1612, there was... so the Royal Archive was just kept in Edinburgh Castle, and they were doing some building work on Edinburgh Castle, and he decided to take it for safekeeping home.
Oh, wow.
And it never got returned, until 1820 or something like that. So just think about that. He's in charge of the archive. There's this building work going on, and what document is it he thinks, now wait a minute, I want to make sure this is kept safe and sound, I'm taking it home, is what we now know as the Declaration of Arbroath, the famous file copy. So I think that's very interesting. He must have known about it. It's not... there'll be piles of all sorts of things in this archive, things that he'll have... He did take an intelligent interest in the archives, I should say, because he copied out some of the 13th century Exchequer records, so he's interested in the medieval period. He's a bit of a scholar as well as an archivist. Many archivists are also scholars to this day, but what does he take home? It's the Declaration of Arbroath. So I think he doesn't tell us why, but even then, 1612, this is before it then acquires more of its fame, because he shows it to people, and his descendants show it to people when they visit Tyningham House, and that's the work that Roger Mason has done that Ewen referred to, which I think is really interesting. But I'd just love to know why did he do it. But I think it's very, very revealing.
Yeah, that's interesting too. I've not heard that or read that ever before, and it does show. It kind of reveals a little bit about its importance. Dr. Cameron, you mentioned a minute ago also, when we were speaking of the modern, kind of implications, the transatlantic. What was it that you were referring to? Were you talking about that connection with the United States, or what?
Yeah, no, just simply that, which you've highlighted yourself, and we were talking about the Declaration of Independence, and then the U.S. Constitution, and then I suppose I was also thinking it comes alive again in that context with the Senator Lott's resolution to create Tartan Day, and I think as you were, Lott, of course, was a Southern senator, Mississippi, was it? I think, yeah, but the South, and quite. And again, it becomes significant there again because he makes that connection, and then people use that. Davey was talking about this circularity of argument, and I read recently that somebody asked Alex Salmond about the connection between the Declaration and the U.S. Declaration of Independence, and he cited Trent Lott's resolution as evidence of that. And Lott, of course, was so there is again that's that sort of circularity. Just because something is resolved in the U.S. Senate, a very august and important place, doesn't necessarily make it through. That's so. I think there's a modern version of that kind of feedback loop that Davey was talking about as well. I think the other thing that's perhaps interesting about it, I could be wrong about this, but I mean there are other potentially significant Scottish constitutional documents. Mm-hmm. One thinks about perhaps some of the religious documents of the 17th century, the so-called National Covenant of 1638, or the Solemn League and Covenant of 1643, which is a different kind of document, or perhaps the Claim of Right of 1689, which is laying out the perceived failures and sins of James the Second, and the reasons why he has to be replaced by William and Mary, and that document is used and reused frequently in the 19th century when the Church of Scotland was dividing and so-called disruption and the creation of the Free Church of Scotland in 1843. The evangelicals who were seeking to create this new church came up with a document called the Claim of Right. In the 1990s, the late 1980s, in the aftermath of the 1987 general election, those campaigning for a devolved Scottish Parliament wrote a document called the Claim of Right. So there are these other documents, the covenants, Presbyterian radical independence covenants of the 17th century, the Claim of Right of 1689. But it's interesting that in the modern context, those documents have receded again, and it's the Declaration of Arbroath that's highlighted, and there may be others. There may be other documents, perhaps Reformation-related documents, Knox's books of discipline, and things like that. But it is interesting that in the current context, it is the so-called Declaration of Arbroath that has sort of risen to the top of the agenda once again.
Yeah, and maybe with the Senate resolution and the creating a holiday around this document too, maybe it's found a place of permanence. I guess time will tell. Dr. Broun, any final thoughts, or Dr. Cameron, anything you'd like to close with, or we covered everything?
Yeah, I mean, well, we can never cover everything, of course, but
I know.
But it's been really good. It's been really good to have this chat. It's been a great idea to bring us together, actually, and get the broad sweep of what's going on. By the way, just the claim. I mean, I think that's a really important point that you have just been saying about these other documents, and I was really struck by the you'll keep me right here, Ewan. The ceremony which initiated the reign of Charles III, in St James's Palace, was in front of the Privy Council and so on, where he has to do various things, including swearing to abide by the claim of right. It's which is some fairly. I mean, I remember he was having to swear to uphold the true Protestant Church in Scotland, or worse to that effect. It was fairly. I mean, it flashback to earlier times. Oh my goodness me! Which, let's face it, is what the monarchy is all about, intrinsically, but actually to swear by the to uphold the claim of right, or worse to that effect. I thought, my goodness me! I hadn't appreciated that we still live in 1689 to that extent.
Yeah.
Whereas we don't live in 1320.
Dr. Broun, will you, because I don't know, and I'm sure there's many listeners who might not. What is a claim of right?
Oh well, Ewan was just describing it. It's a.
Oh, okay. That's
It has to be said. It's a fairly dismal piece of prose. In that it lists at great length as Ewan was saying, the various crimes and sins and shortcomings of the previous king, and explaining how William and Mary will therefore have to swear to do the opposite. So there's a great big long list of things they've got to swear to do, and on that condition, they will be recognised as king and queen. So it is a very interesting point of reference for this idea of a contractual monarchy.
Okay, that's the document that you mentioned that the evangelicals came up with, Dr. Cameron.
No, the original one in the so-called Revolution of 1689, when James II is being kicked off the throne for his arbitrary and despotic reign, and replaced by William and Mary. So it was a document that was written by. It wasn't a parliament, but it was written by an assembly that gathered to do this business, to get rid of James and to replace him with William and Mary. There's a similar process that goes on in England, and their sort of roughly equivalent document is called the Bill of Rights. But I think what Davey's saying is crucial, because it's these documents, and this is why current King Charles III had to do it, because the centrality of the sovereignty of the king in Parliament is what keeps our whole. It's the what's the right word? The keystone of our constitutional system. And it's not true to say that we have an unwritten constitution in the UK. There's all this stuff is written down, but it's not codified in a single document as you have in the United States. So. That's the reason why I guess he had to do that. He had to, his sovereignty in Parliament has to be established and recognised, and yeah. Okay.
Well, to Americans who have a very clean set of documents to refer to, it makes teaching U.S. government very easy, because we look at one document. Although our history obviously is nowhere near as long, but that's something that I've struggled with over time, is remembering the different documents in English and Scottish history that went to creating their governments, and trying to keep them all straight in my mind. But I don't want to keep you guys too long. I really, really appreciate you both joining me and working with me to find a time that was convenient for the both of you to join me on the show. I think this has been a really fascinating discussion, and I really, really appreciate you taking the time to join me today and to add to our understanding of the Declaration of Arbroath as we approach another National Tartan Day holiday. I really appreciate it, both of you.
Very good.
No, it's all a great pleasure. Much. Yeah, very much enjoyed it. Thanks for chairing it so neatly. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah.
Once again, a big thank you to Dr. Dauvit Broun and Dr. Ewen Cameron for joining me on today's show. Carmichael Clan Radio is gaining momentum, and I'm so appreciative of the support from both our listeners and our guests. If you want to support the show, please be sure to subscribe to the podcast and to share it with anyone else that you think might enjoy the shows. You can subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, or subscribe to the Clan Carmichael USA Substack page at clancarmichael.substack.com. By subscribing to the Substack page, each time I release a new episode or an essay, it'll land right in your inbox. So be sure to get signed up to receive all the latest from Clan Carmichael. And finally, if you like what we're doing, please leave a 5-star rating, a positive review, or leave some feedback in the comments section. Your reviews help to promote the show and to make it easier for others to find us, and it lets me know that you are enjoying the shows. So until next time, toujours prêt. See you soon.